Welcome to the Camper Machine Podcast. I'm back again here with my friend Kenny Brook in another episode of Money Moves at Summer Camp. We're going to dig into the details of the fallout from COVID and what some camps can or should be doing to protect themselves and play the money games. All right, here we are. Welcome back to the Camp Business Financials Money Moves at Summer Camp. We are live in the bi-coastal studio. Kenny Brook from Click is out there in sunny California. You're technically, where are you?
Costa Mesa, California.
Costa Mesa. I kept wanting to say San Clemente. That's not.
Grew up there. Good memory.
That's right. And I am Eric Wittenberg from Camper Machine. And you are listening to the podcast where Kenny, who has years of camp operations, as well as years of being a payment solutions provider for summer camps, he kind of pulls back the wool and shows us what's beneath the surface. And I have the experience of being a camp operator for over a decade of running overnight camp that I started with my wife and a business partner, Dan Zinkel. And we're just going to dig into some of the stuff that it always intrigued me. And so I called you for like issues, but I never had the time to really learn. And so our tagline here, Money Moves at Summer Camp. This is kind of the heartbeat of camp. Camp doesn't happen without the campers. A lot of people like to say when they're kind of coming up with a rationale to do sales or recruitment work. But really, if money doesn't move at camp doesn't happen either.
Very well said.
So the first part of our conversation and our kind of opening episode, we covered, just for those of you that might have skipped it, we'll just remind everybody, we covered the issuing side and the acquiring side of what you call the payment cycle.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of started to get towards the but what if danger zone of things that can go wrong. As many camps learned, throughout the COVID summers, and as we continue to learn, is that the consumers have an asymmetrical lever of power in that they have the cards and the big banks are on their side.
Mm-hmm.
One of the if that's not scary enough to make you want to stay tuned to figure out what to do with that. There's a couple other things, that we've already discussed, Kenny, that we want to share that are kind of some big things to watch out for. The thing, basically, we call them the things that can go wrong. Right. So what we're going to lay out here is some examples, give everybody some real clear qualifiers for what are these things called. When does a merchant, like a camp, have to worry about a customer or client or a camp family complaining via a dispute with their bank, their issuing credit company? And what does the acquiring bank say to a merchant? Because you're really the one that you broker those conversations, really, right?
Very well said. Yes.
So what does it mean, services undelivered?
That's a great question. And years ago, camps just took payment. It was really simple. Took payment, delivered camp. And then it became, we went electronic. We did these things electronically, so people didn't come and interface with us. They didn't drop off a check. They had to electronically pay us. And if we were waiting for checks and we're processing pieces of paper or we're handling cash, that's a really slow process. And it's a chasing process, right? Andy Pritikin told me years ago, I take credit cards because I don't have any accounts receivable. I get money just like that. It's handled, right? And I'm like, yes, but it isn't exactly the same as true cash. It's not a final payment, right? It is really a promise to pay. I'm giving you my credit card because I'm going to pay for camp. Now you got to deliver. You got to provide camp for my child, right? Camp has to happen. It has to happen to my expectations. Everything you said happens is going to happen, right? They're going to learn how to use a bow and arrow. They're going to learn how to swim. They're going to, there's this promise to deliver on services is really what a credit card transaction is all about.
Yeah. There's it's two promises. It's like the camp is saying, I promise to do everything you may reasonably or unreasonably expect. And and the parent is using the credit card to say, I promise you can keep this money if I'm happy after summer's over.
Exactly. And we just think, well, the transaction's done. Why is it not permanent?
Yeah. What percentage of camp directors do you think understand those two promises to be part of the transaction?
Oh, from my conversations over all these years, very few truly understand the distinction that it's when I accept that payment, it's a done deal. That's it. That's the belief. There's no true understanding that there's this huge window of time from that payment to when you've actually delivered on those services. It can be not just a year. Heck, with pandemic, it's been 2 years from payment to actual receiving. You just opened yourself to a real microscope coming up here.
Is there anyone who has, and you don't have to, obviously we're not going to use names of camp, we would never do such a thing, but this is what's possible. Is there anyone that pushed credits forward from 2020 that's now trying to use disputes or to get the credits back?
Yes, unfortunately, there's still quite a few.
So just to be totally clear, I charged my card with the camper app in the fall of 2019 because I had a great 2019 summer. And camp directors have been in touch throughout the winter. COVID 2020 hits, we're shutting down camp. Can you roll it? I say, yeah, keep the credit, keep it. We'll be back next year. 2021 comes through and I'm like, yeah, you know what? We've got a high risk person at home. Grandma lives with us and she's like, can't get the vaccine, whatever it is. We're not going to be there this summer. And now it's September 2021. And I call my bank and I say, you know what? Fall 2019, I put a couple $1,000 into camp Run Amok for my kids. And I want it back now.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what happens. And that bank's going to question them. They're not just going to say, okay. They're going to say, well, what do you mean you didn't get it? They'll ask for details. We'll really want to understand it. But it's pretty easy to prove I didn't get what I paid for because of what happened last year.
Yeah. So this is where the upset or a parent that's playing the game can come up with a binary question. Did my kid go to camp? No. Therefore, and the person they're listening to is paying. Okay, so this is what are some other examples? Well,
some other questions there are, did you try to work that out with the camp? Did you try to have reasonable accommodation? There's some reason and rationale in this conversation too, but it's pretty black and white because this is all based on what the card brands say is the reason for a dispute. And it has to fall into one of their categories. And their categories don't really contemplate the camp environment or the trust relationship between a parent and a camp, right? So it's not very camp friendly. That's the best way to put it. So other scenarios, heck, weather gets in the way. It rained at camp for a week and we didn't get to do anything but creative counselor activities.
That's really a thing? You've had people do that?
Oh my goodness, yes. The complaints are, and every camp director knows this, parents aren't reasonable. They just aren't. They're hard to keep happy, that's for sure. But it could be also a behavior related issue that you've dismissed a camper, right? And so the parent can say, well, I didn't get what I paid for. Well, that means they're not taking responsibility, and yet that's not contemplated in the transaction.
Yeah.
Right.
So hold on a second. So you're kind of speaking from the perspective of these kind of big card brands perspective, putting on their lens. How do they look at the camp industry? Like what's their next frame of reference? Like what's the other vertical? Do they look at us like hotel chains, childcare? Like
They
How do they
absolutely.
view us?
Hospitality, travel, entertainment, camps fall into that bucket of uh, you're purchasing something way in advance. You're likely to it's multifaceted. There's so many different elements to that single transaction, from transportation to food to activity to housing, right? So they definitely look at all of those aspects. The size of an average camp transaction is so much more significant than buying a meal out at a restaurant, right? I mean, camp can last for weeks, months. So the size of the transaction, the way out, we call it future fulfillment. The fact that transactions are never card present, they're always key entered through the internet. They call it e-commerce or electronic commerce.
Hold on a second. That's not a good thing.
No.
What is the difference if I have my card versus if I just do an online application?
You insert your chip, all that chip data is getting transmitted. You're tapping with your Apple Pay, you're swiping the card, that is all saying, hey, card brands, we know you're in direct contact with your consumer. So in the camp transaction, we have to kind of emulate that by putting in a full card number, an expiration date, a security code, an address, like all this additional information is really just trying to show that, no, we do know our customer. We really do have a relationship to them. And we prove that with more and more data being transacted. That's the whole reason that chip is saying, you got everything.
So the chip equals
more riskier.
Data rich, which equals deeper relationship.
Less risky, known relationship. Think of it as know risky. My customer.
Got it.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes perfect sense, but that has an impact with how things get disputed, if they get disputed for a reasonable or unreasonable sort of.
Well, there's a story behind the dispute, but what really goes through the system is limited data. It says, okay, how was that transaction handled? Did the address match? Was the security value, the security code, that little 3-digit code on the back of some cards, 4 on others?
Yeah.
That is really not that can never be stored. And for these payment plans through databases, it's never included. So that's one level of security that's omitted in most camper transactions. And yet that's a big flag that says, I know my customer, and we're not doing it because of a payment plan or I signed up in a year in advance and you're doing a recurring transaction on me, right? So we're missing some of those things that are true indicators of risk reduction.
So that leaves the kind of string dangling that we'll have to pull that string a little bit. If I was a camp director that wanted to make my payments more secure, I would find a way to have the parents put the 3 or 4-digit security code.
If it's a single transaction, that can absolutely be part of the transaction. If it's a transaction that's going to be set up for multiple payments or card on file, they call it.
Yeah.
Then it really needs to go into the other areas. It needs to include descriptions. It needs to include billing address, street, and zip. It needs to include sales tax if ever applicable. Just these additional fields of data that, if passed through, not omitted, but actually passed in the transaction, are saying, no, I know my customer. Right?
Got it.
3D Secure. Have you heard of 3D Secure before?
Ooh.
Have you ever purchased online and been asked to verified by Visa or secure MasterCard secure code? Have you ever heard these technology and terms?
I've never heard of that.
Things that, buying on Amazon or buying online and shopping, things have become pretty common for you is to have these additional layers of security involved. Well, just like those chips were created for card present transactions, now there's data available to increase the security and increase that information that says, I know my customer. This is a trusted relationship. So this is technology that really should be incorporated into those transactions.
Got it. So the highest and first level of risk mitigation for your kind of money moves to camp is having these structures in place at the beginning.
Absolutely. Yep.
That's what I'm.
More data is less risk.
That's interesting.
more secure.
Most camp operators, I imagine, would think, gosh, more data, more risk. I have to hold on to this and make sure it doesn't, there's no breach or like somebody doesn't come in and get it. So I understand why that's probably a misnomer.
The other misnomer of that is, or not misnomer per se, but the value add of attaching additional fields of information, it can reduce your cost. Lowering risk in our world of payment processing can actually lower cost.
Wait. What do you mean?
Yeah. The
Like,
fields
but
of data,
even if the card doesn't change, like a discovered card is going to have the same rate of transactions. You're saying it'll change. Right, so they do this automatically. They charge a different rate based off of the data that you collect at the point of sale.
absolutely. Again, if you put in, think of it as required information versus suggested or recommended information. You limit the data, it'll go through. But if you enhance that data, it's going to say, hey, I know my customer. This is a trusted source. They trust me to give me the data. And now you actually get a lower cost. Isn't that amazing?
Is fascinating, Kenny. If I had my like sound effects, I'd be blasting a horn over here. Mind blown. So, and they're doing that real time.
Yes, that's not only in the transaction authorization when it happens, it's also at the settlement time. And that's why it's important that transaction activity doesn't sit and get stagnant or old. It really needs to be transacted and fulfilled. So that's key information.
Wow, it never ceases to amaze me. There's like, I thought I knew what we were going to talk about, but this is totally blowing my mind. So they're adding on, they're taking on all this data and changing. Oh, we're talking about like cents. So it's not. I want to make sure. We're not like, you're not going to get rich. Your camp's not going to like.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah, building a new pool because you asked one more question on your campground.
I actually give you an example that is real life, and that is our nonprofit camps. They actually have a special carve out. We call it the interchange rate for nonprofits, for charitable organizations. Okay. And as long as you're giving all that detail and it's processing successfully and it hits that qualified level, it can be as much as a whole % less than if you passed minimal information.
A whole percent?
A whole %. And think about that. Think about a whole, it's 1% on the value of a camper is significant. That's a big number. And for nonprofits, it is that significant.
Especially if you're a big nonprofit.
I watch out for every nonprofit to ensure, are you passing the right data? Or are we missing an opportunity? It's just significant. So in the for-profit world, it can be as much as 0.5%. And that's the difference between, oh, I just got the credit card number, expiration date, and I'm good, compared to, no, I actually collected billing information, their address, their zip code. I collected a little more information about them, and it can drop my rates by over 0.5%.
Kenny, this is fascinating. And also, I'm quite conflicted because as a marketing, sales and marketing consultant, I set people up with technology. First of all, I didn't know this. And second of all, I would campaign, and I have campaigned for many camps, to streamline their camper applications. Most of the time, I'm talking about stripping away fields that aren't necessary for the application, like camper t-shirt size and things like that. You're not talking about that stuff. You're talking about data that can be tied to an identity, right? So
absolutely.
I just want to be totally crystal clear so nobody comes up, I can imagine a couple of clients of mine that would be like, you said that we needed to strip down that information. Now you're telling me, but we're just talking about the data rich identity and financially relevant information.
Absolutely.
So, is there
related to that card and the card holder? That's right.
That's fascinating. Okay, so is there anyone, and I don't want to go like full name game, but a lot of different camp databases, obviously the big ones, your Camp Brains, Camp Minder, all Campsite, there's probably leaving a couple of big ones out, but aren't they all kind of boilerplate ish? Aren't they all going to be kind of like, is there anything that people can actually do that's anything actionable right now, but like, I want to go get this and have it drop my my rates?
So the systems are there to build security, to reduce risk, to protect you as an organization, to protect the children and the families and the cardholders. So that is the focus and the intention of all the solutions, right? They want to do it in a compliant way. They want to do it in the right way. They want to do it in the most secure way. And these are elements that may or may not be contemplated. These elements of how much data is, because again, that pushback of, quit making me ask for everything. But you're like, no, I do want to ask if it's going to financially benefit, or it's going to reduce risk, or if it's going to protect me from this dispute environment. Those are the things that need to be asked, right? Is how is my camper application and the e-signature and how you're tracking that data going to support me and as a business owner for these potential risk issues? Like, how easy is it to retrieve that data? Can I see where they agreed to the terms and conditions and the refund policy and the cancellation rules, et cetera, et cetera? Like, that has to be available, retrievable, and easily accessed in order to respond to a dispute. You know, that's really what's going on here. Is you got to make sure that your solution is considering that, contemplating it, aware of the risk of not just COVID, but behavior, you know. This is about its best practices, and it's also really ensuring that the business is getting the best position to stand in for financial outcomes as well as exposure risk outcomes.
Yeah. So I totally get that. I just want to peel back a layer to make sure that everybody we're really kind of taking this back to its fundamental kind of levels.
Sure.
We're talking about risk management of the cards, you know, the card kind of the banks, the issuing banks. And so those card brands want to mitigate risk, and they will incentivize you to de-risk your transactions. And additionally, what you're saying now is, on top of doing what you can to de-risk your transactions, you should be prepared to collect. So you said available and retrievable, which I really, that's very specific. The details of the transaction and when they chose to. So I feel like we have to dig back this next layer of, you know, terms, you know, the glossary. When you say terms, you're talking about the camper terms and conditions, camper app terms and conditions.
Yeah, at its core, it's the what are the terms and conditions a parent is agreeing to. We call that the cardholder, right? The parent. What have they agreed to? What have they understood? What is the refund policy? What are their cancellation policies? You know, all of that has to be well documented, visible, and you have to kind of prove that they saw it, they agreed to it, they acknowledged it. They read it, there's a checkbox, they have to take an action in order to say, yep, I agree. The e-signature or e-sign, and that's all retained, not just in the transaction, but for posterity, right?
Yes. So this sort of collateral file that you would want to bring to a dispute if someone was disputing a charge, how often do you have to go to that level? Where it's like, oh, hold on, let me go to my filing cabinet and get these. This is the email where they clicked to start it. This is the and show your whole case.
Yeah, at the most basic level, the most common problem is someone doesn't recognize the charge. They see their credit card statement, and they don't recognize the description, because the description isn't necessarily your camp name. It might be your legal name. It might be your website. It might be, and so they may not just recognize, or maybe it's a grandparent or aunt and uncle that have made the camp purchase as a gift, and they don't recognize. And that can be simple. I don't recognize this transaction. Prove I made this purchase. That is the type of information you'd have to gather and share back to say it was a legitimate transaction. Because if the camp owner ignores that request, it'll then turn into a dispute that they can't even challenge. It's called a retrieval, okay? So that's the most simple form of a dispute, is just, I don't recognize this transaction, especially when I authorized it a year ago and I'm still getting billed randomly over the upcoming year before.
Especially if it's a monthly, like an installment plan. So
Definitely.
I'm a little bit afraid we might have skipped over one technical term that we're kind of like basing everything upon. But you're describing if a parent or a grandparent or the guardian that paid for camp all of a sudden wants to now dispute.
Right. Right.
You know, I feel like that word dispute is probably the one that I learned that's really kind of initiates this whole process of where a camp can get into trouble with credit card payments.
True.
Can you
True.
just explain
Yeah.
that term and what it means to you and what it sets off, and so we can kind of connect everything?
Definitely, because you're right. Some of this language is used in other ways and doesn't make sense in its context. But you're right. As someone who holds a card and you have your features and benefits of being a card holder, you log into your app and you see the option dispute this transaction. That's really what you see is dispute or challenge this transaction. You don't even have to make the toll-free call to have a dispute. It's right in the app. It's right online. The card brands have made it so easy to challenge a transaction that you don't recognize or that you don't agree with or you don't feel satisfied with. It's called a dispute. And that dispute results in either a retrieval of information request or a full chargeback where they pull the money away and say, okay, prove this sale, provide this evidence that says you deserve this payment. They literally pull it away and then say, prove it. All right. And that's called a chargeback. And even before, right when that dispute happens, there is actually an alert that comes through the system. And that's a little tease for later. I'll tell you more about how you can manage alerts. But
I was going to say, don't go to the end. Okay. So you know what, I am, hold on a second. We're going off script here, but this is important enough. I want to lay it out in a graphic because there's a lot going on.
Yes.
And the terminology is important, as is the kind of the flow.
It really is, because this is so misunderstood. Let's do that.
So I'm going to do my little whiteboard thing here on Zoom. And so if we've got I'm just going to draw some circles here to show the kind of the sequence. So there's a nice little purple circle. This is the camper. Let's see, camper app. I can't see. So this is the camper application.
All right.
And let's keep changing the colors. There you go. So there's your camper application. That's the beginning of the card, the payment cycle that we discussed last time, where that literal charging is one bank saying to the other, Kenny said he wants to pay this much to this camp run amok, and are we in accordance?
Yes.
And then, but in between then, there's like any period of time that as we discussed, could be 2 years or it could be a day, or a certain. I'm sure there are some parameters there. Are there? I hope there are parameters there. It's like 10 years. Can you dispute something from years ago?
It's, believe it or not, it's based on fulfillment of service. So the timeline is not just when the transaction occurs. It's when whatever was purchased ultimately is fulfilled. So if the purchase happened on September 28th for next summer, the fulfillment timeline really starts at the end of the camper session next summer. And then there's this window of time that extends beyond that. And it's typically no more than 6 months, but it can be up to 18 months after fulfillment of the camp session. Okay, so the clock doesn't begin at transaction. The clock begins at the end of the camp session they purchased.
So the until fulfillment time period could be indefinite.
It's highly unlikely to extend beyond 6 months after that period, meaning it's easily challenged as, hello, you've had plenty of time.
Yeah.
But the reality is the card brands do extend that timeline of fulfillment of service.
Got it. Okay. So chronologically, left to right, there's this camper application, which is the finite catalyst of the transaction. There's this kind of ambiguous until fulfillment period, which could be very long or not long in the or the worst thing about the camps business is the cyclical nature of the delay, which for everybody, right? But not that everyone's fine, like dying to start camp next month, but it's September now. So there's this until fulfillment period. Now, one of the things that can happen prior to fulfillment or after, which is what you're saying, is that someone can, a card holder, a camp parent, can initiate a dispute.
Yep.
And then you said if the card brand that's kind of resolving the dispute, they could simply say, yeah, you're right, give them their money back. And that's called a
that would be a chargeback.
That's what I just want to double check. I think I knew that, but I want to double check. So chargeback, which means literally money goes back to camp family.
With a request to prove you deserve it.
So you kind of at that point, it's kind of like guilty until proven innocent.
Absolutely is.
So if that happens, the camp family has by default won their dispute, and it's up to you to say, hey, no, I have a case for this.
Yeah, they haven't really won it instantly. It's not like you've got fraud and you're saying, give me credit, bank. It's the bank is researching it for you, is what's happening. So it may sit in this pending status for quite some time while the communication goes on.
Got it. Okay, so now, but if the dispute's initiated and the chargeback is not immediately granted, you said there was some term, I had to write it down because this is going too fast for me. This is like we're on Wall Street, like
retrieval, right?
Retrieval of information, you said.
Yep. A retrieval is really a notification that says, hey, the cardholder doesn't recognize this or doesn't understand this charge. Please provide evidence of their participation. That can be a receipt, it can be a camper application, it can be fax, whatever source of information is. Yeah, they requested this. Maybe it was a phone call and the camp followed up with an email confirmation.
That is a really interesting term, evidence of their participation.
Well, when you're in a store and you swipe a card, it used to be you'd sign for it. Now you enter a PIN number. You whatever you do, you're demonstrating that I made this transaction, right? Yeah. So that's really what they're looking for is show us they authorized this transaction. Now there is one third option we should explore, and that is that the issuing bank says we don't agree, or says they look at it and say there's already been a refund initiated. Like if they already see a refund processed, they're not going to do either of these. They're going to acknowledge that money was already refunded. If that refund was on the same card as the original transaction.
Okay, so in that scenario, you're really saying that that's if the camp is already handling a refund.
Exactly.
But if they're not, and they're getting kind of sideblinded by a dispute where there wasn't an honest and earnest attempt to say, hey, camp director, I want my money back because X, Y, and Z.
Yep. So I just want to be fair and put that on there because
what's the name for that?
Well, that's basically it's a dispute denial. it's the parent's bank saying, nope, we already see a refund issued. We're not going to file this on your behalf. Okay.
Yeah.
But for that to happen, camp's got to be really on it with refunds. They got to be acting in fast order, because the other part of this process happens way too quickly in our world.
So
we also have many camps that will issue refunds via check or to a different card or something, and the card brands don't know it's happening because it's not associated to the original transaction. Just as an aside.
so in this scenario, there are some caveats, right? It's got to be to the same card, done quickly, and the bank has to be able to recognize it.
Exactly. Meaning that's a matched transaction, right?
Yeah,
it's matching to the original transaction.
Yeah. So let's call it matched. Okay, so all three of these situations are kind of ugly because they represent a deviation from what you want to happen, which is family pays in full long before camp. You sitting in the bank, you deliver a great camp program, everyone's happy. So just to make sure we're not we're not fear mongering here. This is what can go wrong, and what does go wrong that you might not know about. If you're a camp operator, if you're a new camp director, if you're starting a camp, you haven't had the privilege of talking a parent through why something happened differently than their expectations. So this is really helpful to kind of have it be laid out. And again, I did this for a long time. I'm still learning this. Of these disputes, you mentioned there's something that happens really quick, and there's some level of monitoring. Is this graphic is like the perfect place to insert that, right?
It really is. And it's what's important to know here is this entire the issues that are happening here, camp databases aren't usually aware of, meaning this is happening through the bank side. And so the relationship you have with your merchant service provider is key and essential here, that they have good contact information, your email, your who to contact, and are communicating this information. Because if you're not seeing these this retrieval information or this chargeback information, you can't take action on it, right? You have no way of knowing other than, well, why did this money get debited from my account? Or what is this letter asking for that's requesting additional information? Or who's this email coming from my merchant processor asking for additional information? So this is something that doesn't show up in your database solution. You have to be monitoring your bank account. You have to be monitoring your mail and your email, or even potentially your texts.
Yes.
From what you set up, who you set up to communicate with your merchant service provider, because you have to be aware of this and you have to take action in a pretty short window of time. Otherwise, you lose the money. It's gone, whether you wanted it to go away or not. All right.
It just flies away. That's why I'm drawing a little wings here. If this money is flying away. So
when does this happen? Like I said, this happens when people have buyer's remorse. This happens when people missed a cancellation deadline, right?
Yeah.
This happens when someone's planning to go to camp and then they get injured, or a family trip comes up, or something else that just is more important than attending camp. That's when this kind of stuff happens.
So this, I totally understand this, because I like this whole thing started because one day you called me out of the blue saying, I think you might have had a chargeback, which I'd be more than happy to share later, because that was an interesting one. But so for the people that aren't, watching on YouTube and they're listening to the podcast, we've got this. I just want to recap and add this final piece, because I think this is enough for this episode of the podcast. The camper application initiates this sort of time sequence here, where there is a period where fulfillment has not been achieved and the transaction has been started. So this time cycle is going on until fulfillment. And then there is a time period where after a fulfillment, a camp family can say, hey, this didn't go down. the way that I think it should have for all the reasons we've stated, whether there's a pandemic, whatever, any number of things that could have made someone upset. And they're going to initiate a dispute. That dispute has 3 likely outcomes, all of which either have work associated with them or a penalty for the camp. They're going to lose their money in a chargeback with a lower the chance to say why you want to fight for your money. There's going to be a retrieval of information required to prove there was evidence of participation on the cardholder, or the bank is going to see that a dispute or the refund has already been processed on the camp's behalf, and the bank will say, ease up, cardholder, camp guardian, camp parent. This has already been resolved. You don't need to dispute it.
And I'm gonna put that little asterisk again on that this is that alerts I talked about. It's an opportunity to reduce risk is with alerts. And so we'll save that for another day.
You don't want to talk about the alerts?
Well, if you're
I
open.
I kind of think that this is the time to say.
Okay, all right, let's dive in. So what's really exciting is that because our world is moving faster and technology is moving faster and people are more quick to file a dispute, the Card Association said, hey, we need to have something in the mix here that allows the merchants to be able to say, if you follow to this set of rules, I do want to give a refund. I do want to give that money back if it was an error or handled incorrectly or whatever else. So these alerts are like pre-chargebacks. It's coming through, the chargeback's coming, but there's this little window of time that if you have the systems in place and you have the partner in place that's looking for that information, they can look at it, look at what you did and say, yep, that should have been refunded. The refund just hasn't gotten there yet. Let's head it off. Let's stop it from ever getting through the system and becoming a chargeback. So
how does that technically work? This is something you and Click does this, right? I mean, this is why
we do this. And there's Ethica and Verify are 2 of the alert systems, if you will, all falling in with something called CDRN and RDR, rapid dispute resolution. And these are all, again, you don't need to know all the terms. Yeah. The point is there is this opportunity, and most people in e-commerce businesses will use these third-party solutions to provide the service and to kind of get in front of this. But it's really becoming more mainstream, and we're bringing it to all of our customer base to say, hey, if you're concerned about this, as you should be, the number of camp directors I've talked to that said, well, wait a second, I dismissed that camper and I gave him a check refund, and then they took the money away and I didn't know it because I was busy running camp and didn't see the mail. Yeah. So
camp directors would miss things because they're busy running camp, taking care of other, sleeping right? 2 hours a day. What's happening?
Yeah. So it truly is some technology the card brands have put in place, and merchants can enroll in and take advantage of these services. So not only do we have that, but we also have an internal team that can manage these chargebacks and help you with responding. Many of my clients know how I personally help them, but this is now a department within our company that is here to actually manage chargebacks on their behalf.
Wow. This is more than alert management, it's dispute management.
It's both. They're 2 different services. Yeah. Alert is getting in front of it before it becomes a dispute. Yeah. Chargeback management is once it is, and how do I effectively respond? Where is the documentation and the knowledge base to support me in being successful?
Well, Kenny, this is like, every time, I feel like I'm going to say this every episode. I came in thinking I knew what kind of conversation we were going to have, but we ended up having a totally different and deeper dive into this. I knew that you had some level of the alert management that Click was providing. But the thing that's really kind of resonating with me now, and I hope this is what listeners are taking away, is that understanding the view of risk and how you are incentivized as a merchant, as a camp operator, to de-risk all of your transactions across the board. It'll literally save you money.
Absolutely.
Or make you money by there. So at the application, collection, verification of the customer level, and being prepared for retrieval of information, and having the chargeback management, so you know there's a dispute coming, let alone needing your payment provider to have to call you, because sometimes that might not happen.
And usually won't. Yep.
Yeah. It's not-
So can we tease the opportunity that let me talk about?
Let's just you got 1 minute. Tell them what's coming.
All of what's coming is, how do you avoid this? What are the steps you take? What are the best practices? How do I keep us out of this trouble? And what's available? So we'll share this with words of wisdoms in the next episode.
Because this is a pretty dark sort of like the world's gonna end. This doesn't happen that much if you do all the other stuff well.
No, that is very true. We're going to give you all the tips to avoid it.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Kenny. I hope everybody found at least one nugget in there, something they didn't know, something to help them protect their camp business and financials, and to help move money better at summer camp. And that was the Camper Machine Podcast, wrapping up part 2 of Money Moves at Summer Camp. Hope you enjoyed and learned a bunch. If you want to check out any marketing automation or consulting info, check out campermachine.com.